Now, please welcome our host, award-winning LA Times columnist and best-selling author of Don't Stop the Presses, Patt Morrison. And our guest, a former 5-term U.S. Senator, Democratic presidential nominee, and former Secretary of State of the United States of America, John Kerry.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As I sink into this chair, I could go to sleep in.
So, Senator, thank you for sharing, excuse me, Mr. Secretary, thank you for sharing a stage with an enemy of the people. Much appreciated.
Well, I've been accused of worse lately.
And speaking of that, President Trump tweeted about you, about your talks with leaders around the world in your capacity as a former Secretary of State, said that your talks were illegal and that you were capital B, capital A, capital D, bad.
He got 3 letters together. It's pretty good. What could I say?
Your rejoinder to Bill Maher said he's got the maturity of an 8-year-old boy with the insecurity of a teenage girl. So you're the father
What I also said is the conversation he ought to be worried about is the one that Paul Manafort had with Mueller. That's the conversation. As I said last night, we've gone from the art of the deal to the art of the squeal. It's a whole new world, folks.
So, as the father of 2 former teenage girls, one of whom is here tonight, do you want to elaborate on the teenage girl thing?
I think my daughter who is here tonight would say, you know what, leave the genders out. It's better without it. So he's got the maturity of an 8-year-old and the insecurity of a teenager. How's that?
Fair enough.
All right.
Are the teenagers in the audience, you know, in your heart of hearts, you know
Are you
who
insecure?
you are.
No. No, I mean,
This is a book that is a personal book as well as a policy and political book. So we're going to cover a lot of territory. But I want to start with your impression of January 2009 when Barack Obama was sworn in compared to January 2017 when Donald Trump was sworn in, after whose inauguration speech George W. Bush was reliably quoted as saying, "That was some weird shit." How did that 180 degrees come to pass in a short time in this country?
it came to pass, I think, because politics is so broken in our country and elsewhere, I might add. And it's broken for a lot of different reasons. But our democracy is not working. It's very simple. So people on the right are mad, people on the left are mad, and people in the center are mad. And I watched the changes in the United States Senate begin probably really in the 1990s. I mean, it began a little earlier than that, but the Senate in the 1990s began to receive people that were the product of the Gingrich Revolution. They came over from the House, and they were more bomb throwers and people who was, you know, it was my way or the highway kind of approach. There was an orthodoxy to ideology within the caucus. And you went through the Gingrich Revolution to the Tea Party, and the promise of the Gingrich Revolution, the promise of the Tea Party, the promise of the Freedom Caucus was, we're going to have less government, we're going to have lower taxes, we're going to get rid of regulations, we're going to kill Roe v. Wade. We're going to, you know. So you had this litmus test litany of efforts that the Republicans in their new incarnations were going to effect. And guess what? They didn't do it, none of it. And so eventually what you had after the Freedom Caucus was a hostile takeover of the Republican Party by Donald Trump. But he did tap into a legitimate anger in our country. And if politicians don't begin to understand that anger, we're going to continue to not be in touch with the American people and with the real concerns and hopes of the people. And I mean, there's such obvious things, frankly, that are going on. But our democracy is broken, not irreparably, as I point out in the book. And I think my whole book, I mean, Woodward's book is a great summary of just how bad it is in Washington. But my book, I believe, I say this without any arrogance or anything about it. I just think my book, because it's a life story of a journey from the 1960s when President Kennedy was killed while I was sitting on a bench at university at a soccer game against Harvard, supposed to be the big Harvard-Yale weekend, and I heard this ripple in the audience and and the people watching, and whispers, "The president was shot, the president was shot." And then suddenly it was, "The president is dead." And it just was a profoundly convoluted time from that moment forward, really, in the 1960s. I think that was the beginning of the defining moment. But then, that was sophomore year. Junior year was filled with the civil rights movement and the effort we made to send buses down to the South to break the back of Jim Crow. And the dogs were unleashed, and the hoses and the lynchings continued. And then we went into senior year, where Vietnam descended on all of us, and we suddenly had to decide, are you going to war? Are you going to graduate school? Are you going to Canada? Now, the Canada piece grew less when I was presented with it, 1965. But by 1968, that was a choice for a lot of young people. So there was turmoil. And I chronicle in the book, I mean, the turmoil was accompanied by this cultural revolution, by a change in the music we listened to.
Right.
I mean, I remember being out in California, in San Francisco, privileged to hear the Rolling Stones and the Grateful Dead live at the Fillmore
What were you
West.
wearing?
Well, I just know I was wearing something.
Always a good start.
Yeah, I mean, it was the summer of love. I was living in the bachelor officer quarters, which is a hell of a name for a place to live, and on Treasure Island, looking back at the city. And I was in damage control school and then nuclear, chemical, biological warfare school. It was fascinating. And as the war grew in its intensity and the opposition grew, even those of us in the military began to feel this transition, and you could see it in what was happening with the troops in Vietnam and the changes. But then I arrived back in the country from my first tour in the Gulf of Tonkin the night Robert Kennedy was killed, right over here at the Ambassador Hotel. And the first things I heard were the victory speech, and then the shots and the turmoil and the chaos. And Medgar Evers was shot a few months earlier before that, and Martin Luther King was shot. And there were pipe bombs in the streets of America, and there were, riots, and Detroit was burning, and it was a very difficult time, and people forget that. So the reason I say all of this is we can get through this now because we've been through it before. And what my book does is traces the transition, the cultural confrontation, and it's very personal about it all. It's not a Secretary of State policy tome. It's a journey, the journey of a lifetime, till this day anyway.
What you write about includes a visit to when there were anti-war protests in Century City here in 1967 when Lyndon Johnson was visiting. And you were alarmed when one of the speakers, Rat Brown, compared Lyndon Johnson to Hitler. When the Vietnam Veterans Against the War went for ghost faces in guerrilla theater, you thought, that's going to scare people, it's too extreme. So now we have some Democratic voters calling to abolish ICE. So what I'm asking you is, you've always looked for more of a middle ground, more of a moderate ground that you seem comfortable with.
Pat, I don't, and by the way, I've neglected to do this, and I apologize to everybody. First of all, it's wonderful to be here with the great Patt Morrison.
Oh.
I thank you very, very much thank you.
I gave him my credit card, so we'll see what he charges for that.
Secondly, it's fabulous to be here in this very beautiful theater, very special place. And thirdly, it's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for coming and sharing conversation. You can tell I'm like a thoroughbred. I was raring to get going out here and, get into it. But I thank you all. Where do you want to go?
You just got thanked by the audience. But the sense of compromise seems to be now quicksand turf. I was struck by a story you told after you ran against...
Well, it is, but we can't let it be. Our democracy will not function unless we have the ability to work through serious issues, and by the way, based on facts. You can't do this. And we're living in just a bizarre time. You know, InfoWars the other day, that's about the right reaction. InfoWars put out a notice that Hurricane Lane that was heading and barreling down on Hawaii was split in two by an energy beam that was fired from Antarctica by me. And I was appalled because, I mean, how could they get it so wrong? I did it from the North Pole, folks. I mean, but think about this. Think about it, seriously. We have lost the ability in the United States of America to have the same baseline of facts. And when Rudy Giuliani can stand up and say the truth is not the truth, when Trump can tweet and stand up from the podium of the White House and talk to America and lie, now reaching 5,000 times. I don't know if we crossed the 5,000 documented times by the Washington Post, but here's a simple reality. Our democracy is imperiled, number one, by too much money in American politics. You've got to get the money out. Number two, we don't have a genuine democratic national election for our Congress because of gerrymandering. You have to end the gerrymandering so you have a legitimate election of Congress. And number three, the people. It's not the rules of the Senate that changed, folks. The rules are pretty much the same. Yeah, they changed the 51 votes on judges and a few things, but basically the rules are the same. What has changed are the people. And if we have a democracy in which people can raise their right hand, take an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, to uphold and protect the institutions of our country, and then they turn around and they show that they are more indebted and more beholden to power, to president and party, we can't make our democracy work. It's shameful what they are doing in Washington today. It's just shameful.
You and I backstage both spoke of the Republican Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose mantra was everyone's entitled to his own opinion but not his own facts. How is it that error is now incidental? In fact, saying things that are untrue is part of politics now. It's the way people can.
Well, it can't be. I don't believe that's where the American people want to be, and I believe that part of our struggle now to bring it back is to practice the politics based on facts and on truthfulness. And here's, look, let me just say to everybody, I think about this a lot as I think about 28 years in the Senate, and 2 years as lieutenant governor, and years as a prosecutor, and having been in government for a long time and worked with and without a lot of presidents through that period of time. And I think about holding Reagan accountable on Contras, and I think about holding Washington accountable when I went after the Bank of Credit and Commerce, which we call the Bank of Crooks and Criminals, and we shut it down. And it had venerable people like Clark Clifford of the Democratic Party and others involved in it. But we kept going. People tried to back us off. I'm the one who blew the whistle on Noriega, the money in the banks, the Contras, Oliver North. We blew that whistle. And it became the Iran-Contra affair, and we held people accountable. But that's not happening now. And I think that what I learned through all those years is this. In 1970 actually, when I first came back from Vietnam, the first thing I did was not demonstrate against the war. Because I was, and I write about it, I was going through a period of trying to sort out, what do I do? How do I take what I felt about the war and make something happen? And I was uncertain of that path at first. But Earth Day came along. And I poured myself into the Earth Day organizing and spoke at various places on Earth Day itself. 1970, 20 million Americans came out of their homes and made it clear to the nation that there were people who didn't want to live next to a toxic waste site, didn't want to breathe bad air. I mean, Los Angeles, you couldn't see across the city back then, folks. And New York and other cities in America. And Woburn Waste Dump in Massachusetts, famous lawsuit. And people didn't want to get cancer from the waste that was. So you have all these real feelings. Rachel Carson had inspired all of us with Silent Spring in 1962. And so this was the culmination of that movement's growth. With Earth Day, we didn't stop. We targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States House. We determined we were going to make the issues I just listed to you voting issues. And not just targeted, we targeted the 12 worst voters in the House. We called them the Dirty Dozen. We had campaign ads around the country about the Dirty Dozen. And guess what? And district for district, we went after them. 7 of the 12 lost their seats. And I learned a lesson then, which is a valuable one for thinking about today. There is nothing like the loss of their seat for colleagues, for the survivors to have their spines stiffened. It works. And so we passed the Clean Air Act, safe drinking water, marine mammal protection, coastal zone management. We actually got Richard Nixon to sign the EPA into law. America didn't have an EPA until people went out and did this. So and when you sit around...
Well, no, and yet the toll that politics has taken on this is example you write about in the Senate where you had Lindsey Graham on your side for a climate change agreement, but the threat of losing his seat was enough to frighten him into backing away from it.
Well, I'll tell you exactly what happened. I was leading the efforts in the Senate after President Obama was elected in 2008, 2009. We began the effort to get a climate change bill. And the House of Representatives, to its credit, under Nancy Pelosi's leadership, may I add, passed a climate change bill. And that climate change bill came over to the Senate. There was no chance of getting what they did in the Senate done in the House done in the Senate because it had a trading mechanism, that dreaded word of today called cap and trade. But I would just comment to you, if you want to comment on American politics, cap and trade was designed by the American Enterprise Institute, the AEI, conservative entity. It came from a market-based oriented approach to governance. And it worked. We solved the acid rain problem in America by putting Clean Air an amendment to the Clean Air Act, which created a trading mechanism for sulfur in America, and that's how we got rid of the problem.
And that was
now
in the
it's
first
a bad
Bush
word.
administration.
Now it's become a third rail of politics. So we had to find a different approach in the Senate, but we got up to 55 votes. I got the major oil companies, Chevron, Shell, BP, ExxonMobil. Actually, we were negotiating with Rex Tillerson back then. And we got the companies to agree they were going to accept a price on carbon. And the Friday before the Monday press conference that we were prepared to stand up and announce this, BP had the blowout in the Gulf. And the BP president had to call me and say, we're not able to be at the press conference. We have to postpone it. In the ensuing few weeks, getting whispers that they were about to have the oil companies with us in this effort, the Peabody Coal led the charge, and a couple of other coal companies started slamming Lindsey Graham down in South Carolina to the point, and I write about it in the book, Lindsey called me on the phone, the most distraught I've ever heard a United States senator, imperiled and frightened by virtue of what they were doing to him with these ads in the state of South Carolina. And that's the money in politics. The American people overwhelmingly would have supported doing something, but a few companies spending a lot of money and targeting it can scare the hell out of people. So that's why we have to fight back. So the end of my message with respect to Nixon and Earth Day, et cetera, folks, we've tried every form of government there is in the world. Everybody has. We've had pure dictatorship, ruthless dictatorship, benevolent dictatorship. We've had constitutional monarchy, parliamentary monarchy. We've had socialism, communism, I mean, everywhere. And as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for everything else. Everything I just talked about denies human aspiration, oppresses, crushes values, runs against the currents of everything the United States of America is as a nation. And what we need to do is get back to the basics of democracy. And there's a magic number, 54.2. What does that mean? That number is the percentage of eligible Americans that saw fit to vote in 2016. 54.2%. When Obama ran and got elected in 2008, it was 62.3%. When he got reelected, it was 57 or 8 point something. But you get the message. The story of the last election was not the people who voted for somebody. It was the people who didn't vote. And we've got to, so when I hear people, first of all, we've got to stop getting agitated by daily tweets. There's much more important stuff to be talking about than these stupid tweets. And frankly, that's what the guy wants. He wants to distract everybody. That's what yesterday was about, because yesterday was the day that Paul Manafort pled guilty, or announced he was going to plead guilty to Robert Mueller. And the serious conversation is, how do we have a president of the United States still who clearly is ill-equipped to do the job and clearly has been on the brink of illegal activities all his life and is now doing it in the White House? That's the question.
This is the first time in this book you've talked about the 2004 election, but before we get to that, to your point about Donald Trump's unfitness, you do not think, though, that impeachment at this point is the route to
Well, impeachment is for
pursue?
high crimes and misdemeanors, and I don't think that incompetence fits under the definition of it. I do think that we have to wait to see what Mueller comes up with.
Your former classmate.
My former classmate. He was captain of my hockey team. He was a great player, and tore apart the defense, which is what he's doing now. But we also played lacrosse. We played soccer together, and he went off to a different college. But he served in the Marines, served with great distinction. He's a really good guy, good man. Obviously, I have not been in touch with him at all. Haven't talked to him during this assignment that he's on. But I know his character, and I have trust that he will do what's good for our country, and he'll do what the law requires him to do. I think that it's silly to speculate, but look, the Republicans did the impeachment thing when a Democratic president had behavior problems in the White House, and it became an issue. But we all said it doesn't rise to the level. I voted against impeachment because I didn't think it rose to the level of impeachable offense. And I don't think that we should be making it a political issue, which it will be if we start talking about it in the middle of the election now. Folks, we have the greatest course correction opportunity we could have 2 months from now. And the best thing people can do is be involved, be engaged, be part of that 60, whatever mind-boggling number is going to come out this next time. Make people aware that off-year elections, as they call the midterms, does not mean that without a presidential candidate, the American people don't know what's good and aren't going to work and aren't ready to change things in our country. And so the key is get involved, give money, be involved, drive a car on election day, take somebody to the polls, call a campaign, adopt a campaign, find out who it is you think you could help. Either go there or get people to go there or make phone calls from where you are, get on the internet, be part of social media, drive this election to a place where Americans reclaim the values that define our country. And nothing will have more impact to change Washington and what the opportunities are for all of us over the course of the next few years.
So this is the first time I've interviewed you which means it's
I
kind
mean,
of
where
a
have you been? I mean, what's the matter?
it's a journalistic first date. On first date, you get the big awkward questions out of the way. So here we are on the political calendar, almost at the point where we were in December 2002, when you declared your exploratory committee for president. So are you even thinking about going there again?
I've tried. You know, try as I have, I'm obviously not successful.
They
in
made me
persuading
ask
people.
you this, you know.
I know they did. I know. Look, folks, I'm not being disingenuous. I'm really just, I don't think any talk about 2020 makes sense right now. We need to see how the playing field comes out, what we are capable of doing in the next couple of months. If we make that course correction, it's a whole different ballgame as to how 2020 may play out. If we don't make it, it's also a whole different ballgame. So let's stay focused. We got to be disciplined here, and I'm going to stay disciplined. And I've said I haven't ruled anything out, but I'm not sitting around talking about it or working on it right now.
Okay, good. So now we can get to the second course, right, in our first
Yeah,
date.
please. What's the main course?
The 2004 election is on the menu, and
Yeah.
and it was a razor-thin margin. It was Ohio, which is called the cradle of presidents, which I guess can also be for people the graveyard of presidents when it comes down to how the elections are handled. And we'll talk about swift voting in a minute, but you know, there were a lot of conspiracy theories about the Diebold voting machines owned by a company that supported Bush. But did it come down to what we saw before us, the location of polling places, what was open in Democratic precincts, the gerrymandering, or I guess you're from Massachusetts, so I have to say gerrymandering. Is that right? I have to do that.
Gary, well,
Get
it's
it- get
called
it right.
Gary's Landing, but it's fine.
Voter ID laws that have cropped up now.
Right,
All of
yeah.
these obstacles that seem to be thrown up to voting. What happened in Ohio?
Well, I'll tell you what happened in Ohio, but let me just put one blunt concept in front of everybody. We cannot be the democracy that we say we are or that we aspire to be, and we certainly can't represent all of the people of our country if we remain a country that singularly among democracies in the world has a party that goes out of its way to prevent people from voting. We have to stop that. Voting is a huge privilege. It's a remarkable, it's the gift of our democracy. And to have these laws being passed and the suppression efforts that they engage in openly and overtly is stunning. Now in Ohio on election day, and let me be very clear about this, folks. I am not here to reclaim the presidency or to suggest somehow that, you know, I'm saying things now that weren't said before, but all of these things were said before. We went to court to try to test the algorithms of the Diebold machines, and we were denied. And the court said, we can't grant that right because it's proprietary information. And I said to myself, what are you telling me? In the United States of America, the election of the President of the United States has machines owned by two brothers from Nebraska who are chairmen of the Bush campaign, and they have the right to say that the algorithm by which you judge whether votes are being siphoned off or it's hackable belongs to them and not the American people. That's a disgrace. And we have to, let me just say, that's why I know the virtues of technology. I believe in technology. There's a lot of good things that come from it. But de minimis, no election should take place without a paper trail to the technology. But more importantly, I would rather see what I have seen in many other countries where I went as an election observer. The United States of America should vote by a federally provided ballot with federally provided machines, and if there are going to be machines, but we should vote by paper ballot in the United States of America. And everybody, we should have a counting system similar to the ones that I saw in Kenya, in the Philippines, in various places, in Sudan, where members of each party, members of the campaigns are all there when each ballot is taken out of the box and tallied and then put into another secure ballot box where they will be held if there is a recount or any doubts about what happened. That is the best way possible to know that we're genuinely electing the person that we wanted to.
And then how to address these obstacles that keep getting thrown up in the way of voters?
Well, we got to win the Congress back to do that. I mean, that's just a blunt statement, folks. If we're going to do half the things we need to do, protect health care so that pre-existing conditions don't become a barrier to people's ability to have health care. If we're going to have a tax reform that genuinely simplifies the system and doesn't give the vast majority of a tax cut to the billionaires, but shares it with hardworking Americans who are not, certainly until the last report, haven't had any raise in income, and many of them are working 2 or 3 jobs and trying to get ahead. You have to deal with the problem of globalization and the degree to which it has put terror in the hearts of a lot of people, not just in America, but in Europe. You see it in Italy, you see it in France, you see it in Hungary and Poland, places that are moving to the right, populist movements that are growing up, that are shredding the real opportunity for those folks to have a representative democracy. And I think it's very, very dangerous. Dangerous here, dangerous there, and it's dangerous for all of us for the things that we have held so dear. And here's what really disturbs me. Well, it all disturbs me, but this is big. I saw reinforced as Secretary of State, and it's a beautiful thing, the degree to which America, as an ideal and as a reality, is an aspiration for everybody in the world, frankly. Not for Putin, but for many Russians. Not for Xi, but for many Chinese. I mean, the reality is that Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, people in countless countries were inspired by Radio America, by our freedom, by what we do for the world. And what we do for the world is extraordinary. I mean, we're on the brink of being the first generation born in Africa AIDS-free. That is because of our program, $30 billion that we put in and that we reach out and help people. You know, Ebola was going to crash across the world, taking lives. We sat in the Situation Room in the White House and we were told 1 million people are going to die between now, September, and Christmas. And President Obama said, we're not going to accept that. He sent 3,000 troops to West Africa. We worked with the British and the French in 3 different countries. And guess what? We stopped Ebola in its tracks. We can do these things. And when it came to refugees out of Syria, I write in the book about Syria being the open wound, and it's a tragedy that it's still
It's
going
a very
on.
moving
It's
chapter.
horrible.
Of Syria.
But the United States led the efforts to deal with the refugees. We put up more money than anybody else. We helped guarantee scrutiny. We applied the law. We went to the United Nations. So I say unabashedly that during the Obama administration, we dealt with more crises in more places to greater advantage for our nation and the world than at any other administration in history, and that is documentable. From the South China Sea to Africa to Central America to South America, you name it. And Trump is just pulling out of all of that, stripping the State Department, roiling our allies, attacking NATO, making adversaries about our best friends like Canada, Justin Trudeau. You run around the world and look at the disarray that he has created. So he's not making America great again. What he's doing is making America alone for the first time in recent history. And it's a very dangerous thing because of what's happening in the world that we need to pay attention to, from North Korea to Middle East, to the Horn of Africa, to South Central Asia, to cyber warfare, to whole new sets of challenges which we are not talking about as a nation, and we should be.
You write about the retreat from the world that this administration is beginning to represent, but you also show that the word treaty has been a dirty word for Republicans. You can probably go back to the League of Nations and find some of that, but
never with the currency it has today.
And so pulling out of the Iran deal, even though other countries remain in it, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, even though it remains as an international accord. The last funding was cut to Palestinian civilians just in the past week by the Trump administration. Where does this animus come from, and what are its consequences? Where does the animus come from, and what are its consequences?
Well, I don't know where the animus comes from. It's clearly not a very well thought out and articulated strategy. It comes from the expression of an emotion that is something we've tried to suppress in our country, which is bigotry, which is hatred, which is nativism, which is white supremacism, which is, an appreciation of Nazism. There are corners of places, regrettably, all around the world, where there are still people who walk around, shave their heads, arm themselves, do horrible things because they hate people. And they think whites ought to be the only people running anything, doing anything, and they just soon go back to a terrible age. That's what we're battling against now. And what I know is that everybody came to this country in a boat, or if not in a boat, some in an airplane in modern times. But this is a nation of immigrants, and we're stronger because we are a nation of immigrants. Now, do we have a broken system? Do we have a broken system? The answer is yes. And Democrats need to be honest about it. We're not going to earn the trust of the country if we sit around and give people reason to believe that we're for, quote, open borders, or we're for that. We have to have a sufficient level of common sense in our approach that we're dealing with a reality. I'm an ex-prosecutor. I'm also ex-military, obviously. Borders need to mean something. I'm ex-State Department. I'm the guy who we hand out the passports. What do we do that for? Why do we have visas? I would go to the Hill to brief the Hill on the numbers of refugees that we were willing to allow to come here and be American citizens. And I'm proud to say that under Barack Obama, it reached an all-time high. But now we're moving in the opposite direction. But we're moving there with an animus, as you described it, with even just open kind of disdain and hatred, disregard. And you look at the president's rallies where, on one occasion he mocks a reporter who has a physical disability. On another occasion, he's attacking, people because of where they come from or who they are or what they do. That is antithetical to everything we are as a nation. Well, and our values, one thought I've had, since World War II, our values are the values that have, by most of the exciting, thoughtful leaders of the world, been the values that were adopted to try to build the global structure around which we build our future. And we can be proud of the fact that from the UN to the World Trade process, which needs reform and needs to redo the way we do trade, all of that I grant, but we've been able to strengthen the world for that. And Europe, I gave a speech last year in Europe, in Berlin, in which I said, Europe needs to believe in itself as much as we believe in Europe. And they need to begin to realize they've been the beneficiaries of the greatest period of peace in their history, ever. Beneficiaries of the greatest rise in income, greatest standard of living, greatest longevity of life now. This has been a place of the remarkable story of the success of democracy. And yet, they're sort of coming apart, it seems, without a sense of direction. That's why presidential leadership is so critical, because the President of the United States has the power and generally has the credibility to walk in and bring people to the table to understand the importance of unity, the importance of alliance, the importance of moving in the direction we've moved in.
When Joe Biden was here, he said that after the election, but before the inauguration, he spoke to people who were working in government, and he said, please stay, please don't go. Sure. We need you, as my words, sort of the human ballast to keep the ship of state on a good track. And did you do that for the Foreign Service? Did
Totally.
You ask people?
Totally. I went to Marrakesh. I'll tell you what, this is a longer story, but I went to the Arctic Circle with my...
That's where you fired the laser from.
Well, I needed to set it up and get it ready. But so I went to the Arctic Circle with my good friend, the foreign minister from Norway, who's a terrific minister and a visionary. And the scientists there said to me, Mr. Secretary, if you really want to understand what's happening in climate change, you've got to go to Antarctica. So I said, okay, I'm going to go to Antarctica. I went back, told President Obama. He said, God, I'd like to go with you. And I said, well, come on, let's go. And he couldn't at the last minute, but I did. And I was flying to Antarctica the day that I got the news. I voted absentee ballot. Donald Trump was going to be our new president. Mind you, that is an airplane that almost stayed in Antarctica. But I saw this stunning beauty of the place, but I learned from the scientists there. There were about 17 to 20 scientists from many, many different countries, mind you. So it's not the liberal conspiracy of the American left, as Rush Limbaugh said the other day, that is producing all these terrible predictions and using hurricanes as an excuse for scaring the American people into believing in climate change. That's what he said. I mean, the whole thing is a fake. But talk about fake. So I learned from them the 3.5 miles deep of ice. The instability of that ice sheet is growing by the day. The Larsen ice sheet has broken off the size of the state of Rhode Island, floating out to sea and melting. I mean, if we have a melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet, we're looking at meters of sea level rise in this century. So I came back from that journey aware of the degree to which we're behind the 8 ball here. We really are. I just was at Jerry Brown and Mike Bloomberg's thing in San Francisco. And I've been working on this issue for 35 years or longer with Al Gore, with Tim Moore, with a group of senators. I've been almost all the conference of the parties through the years. And I led the negotiations on the Paris climate talks for the reason that it is existential for all of us. But I hate to tell you, folks, we're on track right now, not even to hold it to the 2 degrees centigrade, which was our goal in Paris. We're on track to hit 4 degrees centigrade warming of the planet in this century. Now, we're already seeing more fires, we're seeing more floods, we're seeing more moisture in the storms because the warming of the ocean puts more moisture in. We're seeing, you all have lived it here in California, but scientists are beginning to predict massive changes that we may not be able to control, that come because you get past the tipping point. And the tipping point was supposedly 2 degrees centigrade. So now we're heading towards 4. We're not there yet, we're at about 1.5. But now scientists are telling us we're at the point now where we have to talk about mitigation and adaptation, not just prevention. And we can't prevent it unless we take some extraordinary steps. So I have to tell you, a president of the United States right now ought to be convening the G20, put them all in the room, lock the door, and say, we're not leaving here till we fund the Green Climate Fund at the $100 billion that we promised when we went to Paris. We're not going to leave here unless we take a pact that no new coal-fired plant should be built anywhere, that it doesn't absolutely have to be without the latest technology. Because what's happening right now is, folks, between China, Indonesia, Russia, India, a couple of other countries, we're heading towards 250 gigawatts of additional coal power coming online, with another 400 that is planned. And unless we move away from that, there's no way we will meet the goals. It's that simple.
I do want to get to Vietnam, because you spend a lot of time on it in the book. And I want to remind you that if you have a question for Secretary Kerry, you can write it on the card, raise your hand, and we'll try to get to you and then get the question up here at some point soon. Your quick take on, there's a moment in the book when you describe a young woman who was in the Foreign Service who was killed by a suicide bomber in Afghanistan, and she was delivering books to school children in the Zabul province. And I think this is why it's hard to make a case to Americans who think that foreign aid is 20% of our budget when it's closer to 1%.
Right, it's not even 1%, about 1%.
If they don't like us there, why should we bother? Why should we need a role in the world? Why not just retreat to ourselves?
First of all, Anne Smeninghoff is the young woman. She was my control officer when I went to Afghanistan as Secretary of State. And she did a brilliant job. She introduced me to 10 Afghan women who were each running businesses. A remarkable thing that has happened in Afghanistan. Women never were allowed to do anything. And now they were running businesses. When we went into Afghanistan in 2001, there were, several hundred, maybe 100,000 kids in school. They were all boys, no girls were in school. Now there's close to 1 million children, and they are about 45% girls. It's changing. Now, it's not changing the way we want it to. Now, I'll come to why that's important. But we went to Afghanistan because that's where we were attacked from. Vietnam was a mistake, and I called it a mistake when I came back. But Afghanistan was not a mistake to go to. We had to go there because Osama bin Laden attacked us from there, and that's where Al-Qaeda was, and it was critical for us to do that. But the principal reason for staying and being in Afghanistan is to prevent ungoverned spaces from attacking us again. Therefore, to not allow terrorists to be building the ability to attack. And we've seen from ISIS how utterly ruthless and dark and nihilistic it can be. And so I've said to many, many people, I'll just tell you an apocryphal story. I went to North Africa, I won't tell you which country, the foreign minister of the country, and I went out to dinner. They had a very large minority population. And I said to him, you know, I'd really like to know how you manage this population. Are you scared? Do you worry about it? And he said to me, John, I'm terrified. We're terrified. He said, the extremists grab these kids at age 12 and 13. They pay them a stipend to take them away from their families. They go away from their families and they're proselytized to. Then they suddenly are turned. You don't have to pay them anymore because they are true believers. And they go out and become recruiters, and it's exponential. And the foreign minister of this country said to me, you know, they have a 35-year plan. We don't even have a 5-year plan. Now, that's why I think it's so critical for us to be in various places. Not the way we are now in Afghanistan. We have to change. We have to transition out. And there's a way to transition out without ignoring the reality of what we need to protect ourselves. But folks, there are 2 billion young people 15 years old to 24 in the world. I call it the mischief age. And
back to the teenagers.
No, not the teenagers. These are people who have cell phones today but no jobs. These are people maybe 350 million strong who will never go to school, never school. Yet they have a cell phone, a smartphone, and they can see what everybody else in the world has. That also means they know what they don't have. So they're even more susceptible to being sucked away into something. I think this is a global challenge, not a US challenge. But it's why we need a United Nations. It's why we need global engagement. It's why we need leadership, because all of us have an interest in not allowing an ISIS to spring up and create a migration that is, you know, churned Europe in a way that makes Europe an unreliable ally now. And they think we're unreliable because of our administration. I mean, this is dangerous, folks. The world was moving, and we are moving, by the way. I'm an optimist. I believe everything I've laid out to you can be solved. And I'll tell you before we leave here tonight why I believe that. But coming back to what you asked, Pat, I just think that we have to connect to people the dots. You have to connect the dots. That kid in Egypt today, or in an African nation, or in Pakistan, that's not just their problem. And if we want to travel the world, if we want to be engaged as we are in the world, if we want our citizens to be protected when they go around the world, if we don't want to be Fortress America, shutting ourselves off, which, by the way, will never work economically in today's world, you have to be involved. Jobs depend on it, life depends on it, and the future depends on it. And solving problems like climate change and terrorism depend on your ability to be able to work together.
And nature and politics abhor a vacuum, so where we retreat, China or Russia would be willing to step in.
It's happened.
It's in Africa.
China right now, ladies and gentlemen, is running a program called the One Belt, One Road program. And it is touching on more than 68 countries, maybe 70 different countries. China is investing $1 trillion a year in this project. China has built 40.
This is in Africa, right?
This is, no, across Asia.
Oh,
it's
Asia.
it's the new Silk Road. It's the old Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road, rekindling of the old trading Silk Road. And they've built a railroad from China that goes to Europe, 49 different routes. I think it's 7 or 9 European countries that are the end of this journey. It's cheaper to send goods from China by railroad to Europe than to do it by the sea route or by air today. So, and China is spending $500 billion building research and technology labs in each and every one of the countries that the One Belt, One Road touches. China is building ports, 6 or so ports, through the Indian Ocean into the Persian Gulf, et cetera, Djibouti, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka. And so, you know, we can't retreat like that. Not if the values that we care about matter, and not if we're going to have a global trading order and a set of relationships in the world where countries are working together. But China, under President Xi, and Russia, under President Putin, are very busy promulgating a new narrative. And the narrative is that the liberal order of the West is dying, the United States is in decline, and we're in the rise. And they are rising. But I think it's incumbent on us, therefore, to have a vision for our nation, which moves in a much stronger, much clearer direction. The antidote, so I go to the positive, folks. The antidote to climate change is not something we have to discover in the future. We have it now. It's right in front of us. It's called energy policy. Energy policy solves climate change, because climate change comes from how we burn fuels, how we provide electricity, how we do our buildings, how we do cement, different things, so forth, our automobiles, combustion. It's all choices. And to paraphrase President Kennedy in his inaugural address, I mean, there isn't an issue on Earth, except for volcanoes and storms now, but even storms we affect. There isn't an issue on Earth that isn't human-caused when it comes to our safety and our security and the fundamentals. And we have the ability to be able to address every one of them, Pat.
There are several issues I do want to get to, so perhaps you mentioned Putin. If you can speak briefly to Russian hacking, because if he's saying that the West is in decline, he's the one who's meddling, maybe responsible for
Absolutely, and
so.
he is. He's trying to hasten it. Putin lives with a deep sense of grievance over the loss of the Soviet Union. He's a KGB guy, and he is still a KGB guy in that regard. There are certain things that he takes as slights. He objects intensely to the expansion of NATO. He objects to our deployment of ballistic missile defense and so forth. And there are other grievances, but the biggest grievance is his sense of the place of the Soviet Union. He's trying to rekindle some of that. And yes, he is trying to hasten our decline. And China, frankly, you know, is a competitor in that regard. I think both can be managed, but they can't be managed by a president who clearly has the inability to hold Putin accountable.
And a Congress that seems reluctant to take up its role.
Correct. But you know, the other thing we have to get back to, I don't want to run out of time here to talk about sort of the solutions to this. I think John McCain and I write about John McCain in the book, you know, we came from very different places. He was a prisoner of war, conservative, and he was flying an air war, and he was shot down and spent 5.5 years in prison. I did not go to Annapolis, he did. He was imbued with a father and a grandfather who had been Navy admirals and very, very distinguished. He had a huge mantle of weight, historically, of legacy on him in that regard. And so I saw a different war. I was in the Mekong Delta in a little 50-foot boat, which was running up and down these narrow rivers, constantly getting shot. It was a different war. And I was on the ground to some degree, seeing what wasn't working. So John saw some things, I saw some things, we came back. He didn't understand me, I didn't really know him. And then we were thrown together on a flight to Kuwait one time, right around 1990, 91, at the end of Desert Storm. And we were seated opposite each other by seniority in the Senate.
This is where the juniors were in the back.
Well, no, we weren't that far back, but we were, you know, because we were the senators, so the senators weren't that far back. But we were back among the senators, yes. And we were facing each other, and everybody else had gone to sleep, and John and I were still wide awake. So we talked into the night. And it was the most important conversation I had in the United States Senate, because we agreed that there was still too much war in America. People were still torn apart in 1990. Newsweek magazine covered had a cover story saying, "Are they still alive?" with pictures of prisoners on the front of Newsweek. And Rambo movies were the vogue back then. And so there was this mythology that had taken hold that we had left prisoners alive in Vietnam. And John and I both wanted to move our relationship to make peace with Vietnam. And what we decided to do was not only make peace with Vietnam, but make peace with ourselves here at home. And so there's a piece here. I don't know, Pat, can I share it with people?
Sure, and then there's another bit I'd like you to read too. So if you've got, what page was that on that we?
I just bought these wonderful Foster Grant $25 deals today. Tired of losing my glasses, folks. So here's the deal. We in order to win this battle, John and I took on the major responsibility for POW-MIA committee, because we knew the first step we had to do was resolve that in order to change the relationship with Vietnam. And we put together the most incredible accounting process with the Vietnamese, with helicopters landing again in hamlets, thousands of people coming out to see what was going on. It was an incredible thing. And here's what I wrote. No country in history, in all of warfare, has ever done as much to implement an exhaustive accounting of all the missing and captured in a war. The American people can be proud of what our teams accomplished and continue to accomplish in this endeavor. Most Americans are simply unaware that even today, we have American military personnel who continue the search in Vietnam. We still dig up the crash sites of a C-130 or Phantom jet. We still climb to remote mountaintops and excavate the earth in a rice paddy or village. On one visit to Vietnam, I was taken out to a lush green field near a small farm. There, a complex scaffold of wood had been built, leading down a ramp into the excavated area of a downed C-130 that had crashed and never been recovered. I walked into the area and had an eerie feeling that I was literally walking into the crew's resting place, their grave. God had buried them in the very place they had died, but we were going to finally bring them home. I wondered about the circumstances of their loss, whether they were killed before impact, or whether there was time for terror or panic as they plummeted to earth. Had anyone survived for a while? Did the plane hit with such an impact that it drove itself 20 feet below the surface we were walking on? Inside the excavation, the troops working painstakingly to sift the earth and scrape away time, explaining to me how they managed their own emotions and performed the difficult task of recovering the fragments of what was once a vibrant, determined team of young Americans at war. I was amazed by the meticulous archaeological methodology of finding scraps of clothing, a tooth, a fragment of a bone, and then undertaking the extraordinary forensic investigation in our labs in Hawaii to make a positive identification. This enormous commitment to keep faith with American military values has produced a remarkable record. The remains of more than 700 service members brought home to still mourning families who all deserved answers. This work was one of those rare chances you get in public life to actually bring people something they waited for more than 2 decades, peace, the peace that comes with closure. But for me and for John McCain, that wasn't the only reward. In our new friendship and in the work we did, we were ending the war about the war. If a protester and a prisoner of war can find common ground on the most divisive of issues, finding common ground on almost anything else didn't seem so hard after all. That's the story, folks. That's what we need to do.
And that's a transition to a passage you wrote that really brought me to tears. And I'd like you to read that, and then I'd like to ask you a question from that.
Well, I don't know if I could read it without also coming to tears. But, I was, just tiny background. those of you who've been to Normandy, to the beaches of Normandy, you know what sacred ground that is. It's a remarkable place. Colville-sur-Mer. It's an American property deeded to us in France. And it's the resting place of the, mostly the guys who've lost their lives on the beach, but not just on the beach. And I've always found it mesmerizing and it's just awe-filling. I mean, because that task of coming at a beach with the most incredible fortresses on the bluff, huge concrete bunkers of the Germans with every kind of artillery and machine gun and mortar. And these young Americans came in on those Higgins boats in the landing. You saw some of it in Private Ryan, in a sense. And they somehow forged their way across that beach and up the bluff and won the day. So it is a...
You were visiting with your wife.
I was visiting with my wife-to-be. We weren't married yet. But I had taken her there in order to share this place with her because of the emotional and historical sweep of the place. And here is what happened while we were there. The entire time we were there, we went all the way down to a near-deserted part of the beach where troops had broken through on D-Day. There we sat on some rocks at the edge of the beach. The tide was rising, and we measured each wave as it reached closer and closer to the rocks. The entire time we were there, mesmerized by the stillness and the beauty, an older gentleman, and we presumed his wife, were sitting together in an embrace, looking out at the water, not moving, lost in thought. I am certain he was a returned veteran, someone who survived that extraordinary landing, someone who had come back to find peace and perhaps remember the friends he had lost at that very place. Quietly, but deliberately, he stood up. He took off his clothes piece by piece. Then, completely naked, with a squeeze of his wife's hand, he walked straight out into the water, unabashed, unembarrassed, without awareness of anybody watching.
Yeah.
Lost in his memories of the moment. He seemed to be performing a ritual of purity, allowing the waves to carry him in and out as they once had washed soldiers' bodies back and forth until the dead were finally recovered after the fighting on the beach. Teresa and I, holding hands, watched in silence. We were frozen in that spot on the beach as if for an eternity. To this day, it is one of the most touching, beautiful moments we have ever witnessed together. It was mystical and a gift. That's it.
That deserves your applause. Do we have to have a war to have a shared sense of national purpose and vision? We seem to have somehow lost our way.
No, we purposely, and I make it very, very clear, folks. I'm sorry to get so, I just can't, it just brings back a lot, and I think you all understand that. I particularly make it clear, and I want all of you to please grab onto this. Every day is extra is something that our crew would say to each other because we were lucky. We came home. We could have been killed on any given day. And I remember leaving behind the boat that had dozens of holes in it, some of them inches above my head. So it really had meaning to us about this idea of every day is extra because we got to come home. We got to have families. We got to have children, got to get married, got to be, people, citizens again. And so every day is extra is a gift. It's a recognition that you truly do have a responsibility to try to live a life of purpose and to give back, particularly to honor the legacy of those who gave their lives for all of us. And that should sober everybody up in a sense. It should be very inspiring to think, God, I mean, as I write in the author's note, there are worse things than losing an election, than losing a debate. And the worst thing of all would be to sit with indifference watching a whole bunch of problems. That, to me, is what every day is extra means. But it doesn't just apply to somebody who goes to war. It really doesn't. You have a car accident, you're lucky, you survive, you learn, you have cancer, or someone in your family survives. We should all live with this notion that every day is extra, because it is.
But where's our national sense of
Well,
this? We had the
that's
space
got- you know,
program,
that
or
is
our leadership in the world.
That is supposed to come, Pat, from leaders. I mean, that's the nature of a republic and of a democracy. President Kennedy inspired. I was inspired to go into politics and to be a public person because of President Kennedy. Ronald Reagan inspired too, by the way. And you have to look for people who are capable and prepared to honor the right set of values, the right approach, who are large enough to be able to try to lift a country and take it in the direction it needs to go in. And historically, we've been pretty good at producing that. Franklin Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Barack Obama, and we've done a good job of being able to find people who can touch that note and make it happen. That's what we have to do. That's why your participation, everybody here, is so important. But I just remind everybody here, when Ben Franklin walked down from Constitutional Hall late at night, hot summer night, having finished the work on the new Constitution for the United States of America, it was hard work. There was a woman who shouted at him and said, "Tell us, Dr. Franklin, what do we have, a monarchy or a republic?" And he said to her, "A republic, if you can keep it." That's old Ben was talking to us now, and that's what Every Day is Extra is all about.
Marit Orlis is waiting in the wings. She does not have a cream pie, so don't worry, this is no Bill Gates kind of assault, but she does have your questions from the audience. And before I get to them, there's so much personal in this book. What did you learn about yourself as you wrote this that may have surprised you?
Well, first of all, it was hard to write some of this. I mean, I really dug down. I think that, I'm not sure that I learned something about myself, but I confirmed in myself lessons learned along the way. Most notably out of '04, I'll follow my gut. That's what I did as Secretary of State. I'm not going to listen to the, consultants and the other people, because we had a war of consultants in '04 over what we should be doing with the Swift boat guys. And my gut was you go out and take them on and answer it and answer it and answer it wherever it's rising. And
as you say, the way Barack Obama dealt with.
Well, I thought Barack Obama dealt the right way with Reverend Wright. And that was my instinct, actually, initially. I wanted to go out and give a speech on Vietnam. But what happened is everybody was coming in and saying, oh, the country doesn't want it. It's in the past. It's not cutting in the polls. It's not. But I saw an ad in Ohio, and I called the campaign. I said, folks, I just saw an ad. And if I wasn't decided in this race and I saw that ad, I wouldn't vote for me. And we cut an ad, and that's when they started to do it. It's too late.
And there was too much money.
I'll tell you something that is not well known, and I do write it a little bit in the book, but I'm not going to say it. It's not in the book as declaratively as it should be for, just as an editing matter. We were going to win that race on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning. We were winning. And everybody knows that. And the Bush campaign knew it. And on Friday, I was in West Palm Beach. When I got back while I was giving the speech, my campaign guys were running around, and then we got in the car and drove to the airport, and I was told an Osama bin Laden tape has just been released by Al Jazeera, and we're not going to like it. And I made the best, strongest statement I could against it. Bush made a statement about it, but they ran an ad in Ohio the next day with Bush hugging a little girl. And the tagline was, "He can protect you." And what the Al Jazeera tape did was take the campaign off the ground we had put it, which was healthcare, jobs, economy, work, fairness, and put it onto security, which is what the Bush campaign had worked overtime to try to highlight. Because the day I came out of Boston, on my convention, the day after my speech. They declared a red alert for the nation. The day I announced John Edwards' as campaign, they declared an orange alert for the nation. I mean, they were very good at using it. And a couple of years later, Governor Tom Ridge, who was Department of Homeland Security, admitted publicly that he thought it was used politically. So the weekend turned into national security, and as you know, in the afternoon, the exit polls indicated everybody thought I was president for 4 hours. I was president. It was a great presidency. And
4 more hours. 4 more hours.
yeah, and that was the chant. But I didn't concede, obviously, until late in the afternoon the next day, because we were looking at Ohio very, very closely in terms of challenges and other things.
And you calculated that it was the same Supreme Court that had made the decision in Bush v. Gore, and
that was
expected
part of
the
the
outcome
calculation.
to be the same.
But I'll tell you this, folks, there's no question in my mind. We had machines we actually had taken out on Election Day from the precincts. When people called our headquarters and said, we pushed Kerry, it came up Bush. This happened. And we had those machines actually taken out. But there were other reasons added to that for some of the difficulties and where we would go forward. But look, if we'd gone to the Supreme Court, you'd have had the same 5-4 decision you had before.
Do you think, had things gone differently, would Bush have conceded, or would that?
We were told in the afternoon, we were actually told this, that George Herbert Walker Bush had visited with his son in the Oval Office around 5 o'clock, 5:30.
On Election Day.
On Election Day, and we were told that by the Secret Service, our Secret Service indicated what their Secret Service, because they all know what they're doing, that a movement had been scheduled around 8:30 for them to go over to the Reagan building. And I suspect what happened was something very similar to the Michael Hooley moment with Al Gore when they had gone to concede, and he rushed up and said, no, not so fast, and they pulled back, and they didn't. And then late into the night, we were all sitting there waiting and working on Ohio. But if in the end 60,000, 65,000 votes had voted the other way, or been registered to vote the other way, I would have been the President of the United States, yes.
Here's some audience questions. Here's one. Do you think that the damage done to the State Department by Pompeo and Tillerson can be reversed?
If we elect the right president next time, it'll be reversed in a matter of months.
It does beg the question,
I mean,
whether
the policies, it's going to take us longer. We got to hire people and bring them back to the State Department. And, you know, there's been a terrible loss of qualified people who've resigned and retired.
And has this done larger damage to the idea of public service?
I think, you know, it's done damage to the current crop. But my judgment is there are a lot of young people around the country. I look at these candidates, they're terrific. There are a lot of people running for House of Representatives and Senate. And we're going to, you know, if we go out and do our job, we can win back one or both through the hard work of an election process. And it's going to be due to the quality of a lot of these candidates. So I think what's happening is people are getting angry at what's going on, and they're ready to get involved and ready to go out and win again. And maybe we'll have a resurgence of the kind of energy we had in 1970 around Earth Day and 1972 and the Watergate class of 1974. There was a response to Richard Nixon. People will realize the single best way to reclaim the country, the single best way to make our democracy to work is to go out and be the person who's helping to make it work. That's how it works.
There's mention of Merrick Garland and the fact that senators wouldn't even meet with him when he was nominated.
Well, that was disgraceful.
10 months before. So is the problem with the Senate the institutional rules or the people who are there?
Yes.
A and B.
I said earlier, it's more the people than the rules, and it really is more the people than the rules. Look, there's only one party in the United States of America in its history that nominated for a president a person who didn't believe that his successor or the current president was an American citizen. There's only one party in our history that has stood up and said, our purpose in being here in the United States Senate is to make the president a one-term president. It's beyond disgraceful. And then, when they take an oath to uphold the Constitution and to uphold the institution, one whole year, they stonewall Merrick Garland, don't even have the decency to give him a conversation or a hearing. and then they, steamroll the current nominee to the point where it is, at least. We don't know what's going to happen yet. But I think, folks, if that isn't a motivation to go out and teach them that, the old saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. We're going to go out and win it back.
Here's a question. You may have addressed this with climate change, but what do you perceive as the most pressing international threat for the next generation? Is it climate change?
Well, I don't reduce it to one thing because I think it's a mistake to do that. It's much of what I've just talked about here today. It's yes, climate change, because climate change is existential. 51% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the oceans. We're busy between acidification from climate change and pollution and overfishing. We're changing the whole chemistry and capacity of the oceans. That's dangerous. And I'm not sitting here telling you that I can predict to you every downside of what is going to happen. Nobody can. No scientist can. But there is a precautionary principle in the context of public life. We buy insurance to protect our homes. We buy insurance to cover us if we have a car accident and so forth. We buy our life insurance. But we're not buying global life insurance right now to deal with things that literally can kill us. And so I look at this challenge and I say to myself, the biggest market the world has, I think we have to sell it more in economics. The biggest market the world has ever known is energy. The market that a whole bunch of people got rich on in Massachusetts and California and Texas and places in the 1990s was the tech market. Mostly laptop computers and mobile phones as they came online. And the internet was invented, 1990s. The fact is, that was a $1 trillion market with 1 billion users. The energy market is today a 4 to 5 billion user market with trillions in value. And guess what? We're going to spend something like $27–30 trillion or more on energy over the course of the next 30 years. We now have solar that is letting contracts completely competitive with coal. I mean, it's 2.9 cents, 3 cents something. Coal, they never take into account black lung. They never take into account the cost of coal dust and sludge. They never take into account the transport of coal. They never take into account the highest cause of children being hospitalized in the United States in the summer is environmentally induced asthma, and we spend $55 billion a year on it. They never take into account that 3 storms last year, Irma, Harvey, and Maria, cost you $265 billion to clean up after. And that $265 billion, folks, is 1/3 of the Defense Department budget. It's more money than we put into the Commerce Department, the Education Department, the Labor Department, and at least 3 other departments, 6 departments. What are we doing? We're not building America the way we ought to be building America. The Chinese have a high-speed rail. I've ridden on it. It goes 300 miles an hour from Beijing to the coastline. And the Chinese, and the attendant put a glass of water on my desk when we were tripping. It didn't even move. Didn't move, the water. I look at us. Jerry Brown's trying to do a high-speed rail in California. In New York, the port authorities rebuilding LaGuardia. We can't name one major national program of vision for the future in our country. We invent the internet, we go to the moon, but we're not rebuilding America. We should be. Look at the traffic jams people sit in every single city in America today. It's
preaching
stunning.
to the choir.
And so, it's insanity. And what do we have? We have the regional and the Acela on the East Coast. It can go 150 miles an hour, but do you know how many miles it does it? 18 miles between Washington and New York, it goes over 150. It can't go under the Baltimore Tunnel fast because the tunnel will cave in. It can't go across those bridges of the Chesapeake because the train will be in the Chesapeake. This is I got to tell you, folks, we don't even have an energy grid for America. We have an East Coast grid, West Coast grid, a little grid across the north from Chicago, the Dakotas, and Texas, of course, has its own grid. But, you know, if you have good energy produced in Minnesota or Iowa, which we do, can't sell it in other parts of the country. I think we ought to rebuild America. I believe the American people could get excited about rebuilding our own country in a way that prepares for the future. And we ought to be doing it.
Secretary Kerry, we have to let you go, but it sounds like you could be running for governor of California.
I haven't thought about that. Not bad. Folks, we got to, you all control this. Believe me, my message, I know it's simple as a message, but it's real. It is real. We can organize. 9% of Obama's vote went to the current president. 7% of Obama's vote didn't turn out. That's 16, if my math is right, percent of the president's vote that didn't help us. We can take this back, but it's going to be up to you. You got to go out and do the work.
All right, he set the challenge for you. Thank you very much to Secretary John Kerry. And
Thank you very much.
Every Day is Extra.
You're great. Thank you. If I can hug you with your hat.
Thank you, of course. Yeah, I think you can get through.
Thank you very much. Thank you.